Oh, hello. Many Magic the Gathering players ask the question, or rather make the statement, Splinter Twin did nothing wrong, because for many Magic the Gathering players, especially in Modern, Splinter Twin did do nothing wrong. That's what I want to talk about today, and so I have invited the master of Modern himself, Magic Pro Historian Extraordinaire, Ben Bateman, is joining us here at Tolarian Community College, and we're not going to debate whether or not Splinter Twin should have been banned, but we're going to discuss what the effects of that ban were, what other incidents in Modern over the history of Modern may have occurred as a result of that ban. For example, I'm going to make arguments that certain other crises in Modern might have been prevented had Splinter Twin not been banned. And you're going to tell me whether you agree, coming from your professional and expert standpoint. So, Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, man. This is really exciting. I've been obviously a big fan of what you do for a long time, and this is a topic. You and I actually started to have this conversation recently, and it was like, this feels like this is official. We need to make this an actual official, because we can't just do this for an hour at dinner. This doesn't work.
Right. Well, we were hanging out and talking about it because it's something I do. I love Modern, and I care greatly about Modern. And I know that it's a meme at this point, oh, Splinter Twin did nothing wrong. But I might argue there's a reason that it's a meme. Think of all the bannings that Modern has had. In 10 years, I'm willing to bet people will still be commenting about Splinter Twin, but they probably won't be making jokes about Hogak. Why? Because Hogak did need to be banned, but I don't think Splinter Twin needed to. It certainly is an interesting discussion point. Before we get started, just let the folks at home know, who are you and what do you do in the community, that in case they're not familiar with your work?
Yeah, so Alex and myself, Alex Kessler, we do the Masters of Modern podcast. We've been doing that for about 5 years. We were the first sort of official Modern podcast. We have a YouTube channel we do as well now.
I'll link all this in the thing.
Yeah, we do all kinds of content, everything from, top 10 red cards in Modern to conversations just like this one. We like to think of ourselves as historians and also really enthusiasts. So I've got a lot of silly brews I've taken to GPs over the years and popularized, and a lot of love for Mir Superior and Grand Architect and favorite cards of mine. That's way more kind of what we do. And so I've always been a brewer. I love to try to win with original ideas. I don't like to play tier 1 cards if I can avoid it. And that's kind of my story with Magic.
That's awesome. And that's also why I wanted to have you here, is because you are going to be taking a much more historic, or dare I say, blue approach. And in many ways, I am, despite being the professor, I am going to be arguing from a more passionate red gut feeling, a feeling as I just have been a player of Modern. I don't play in GPs to top 8 or spike a competition. I play Modern because I love playing with old cards in a non-rotating format. I like 1v1 Magic. I like what Modern has to offer. And I was playing in Modern since before even the first Modern Masters set. I just love the format so much. I've been there with it since the beginning. And in my opinion, the banning of Splinter Twin was not only wrong, but it goes against everything that the Modern format was designed to do and function. It is the very antithesis of Modern as a format. Let me tell you what I mean by that, and then I want to hear your response. I believe that Modern came out right after they discontinued Extended.
Yep.
And the idea, for those not familiar with Extended, is that this was a way to play with your standard cards after they rotated out of Standard. And it was basically a longer period Standard. It had its own rotation. They changed it a couple times, which was never a good sign when they start tinkering with things. It was 7 years, and then it went to 5 years.
Overextended. New Extended.
Right. They just can't leave it alone. And that also is what I'm going to be arguing today, is just leave it alone. Legacy players like to joke that the best thing about Legacy is that Wizards ignores them completely. That used to be Commander, but that's another video. And in Modern came out as a place with Extended no longer a supported format or a thing going on at local game stores. There needs to be a home for cards. There needs to be a place where when cards rotate out of Standard, you can still play with those cards, because otherwise it's not a collectible card game. Otherwise the cards expire after 1 year, might as well be thrown out, have no value, have no purpose, have no reason, and that is not going to be good for the overall health of the game. So the Magic the Gathering ecosystem requires there to be a home for those cards. Legacy can't be that home because of the reserve list. Because of the reserve list, Legacy will always be prohibitively too expensive for the majority of Magic the Gathering players who can't afford those reserve list cards. And so that's where the concept of Modern came from, is let's go forward from the reserve list. Let's pick a point, and then it'll be basically like it's, I don't want to say Legacy Light because that's what I call Pauper, but new Legacy, which is no reserve list, and they picked that point, and the Modern format was born. And I think that that's important to remember, is that the very basis and inception of Modern is that it doesn't rotate.
Yeah, it doesn't rotate. And I think one of the things you mentioned to start this conversation that's really, really important for people to remember. So the first pro events, the first Modern events that were happening were early 2012, right? That's when people remember like Aggro Loam being the first deck to win a GP, or people remember those initial bannings after the quick extended switch to Modern Pro Tour. But the thing is, Splinter Twin didn't last that long. Really, it lasted, at this point, Modern has been around longer, right? So more than half of the existence of this format has happened since that banning happened. And so that's a really interesting thing to think about, which is that when you talk about what Modern was designed to be in the first place, the sort of idea of Modern, well, it's changed pretty drastically. It isn't what it was those first few years. Those first few years, it was supposed to feel, I think, the way that they wanted Pioneer to feel right now, or very much the way that they wanted any of those old versions of Extended to feel like. Just throwing it on the wall to see if it stuck. This one just happened to stick.
Well, you say that Modern certainly has existed longer without Splinter Twin than with, but ever since the banning of Splinter Twin, is it fair to say that Modern has essentially been on the decline, that Modern has been going down a road of it's been one disaster after another? We can go through all of these. It's almost like the Modern format was so shaken by the banning of Splinter Twin that we kept having these overpowerful dominant decks cropping up. Now, Splinter Twin was not an overpowerful dominant deck. Splinter Twin was not dominating. It was a consistent deck. It was a consistent turn 4 deck. It was in many ways the apotheosis of a Modern deck. Clockwork, gatekeeper deck, we used to call it. It kept other decks that might otherwise get out of control from being able to do so because it was just so darn efficient. But it was not 20% of the meta. It was never 20% of the meta. Right now in Pioneer has been around for a matter of days.
Compared to Modern, at least, yeah.
But really, Pioneer has been around for a matter of days comparatively. And we already have a deck that is at 20% of the meta, and that's why I've lost a lot of faith in Pioneer, is that it's become a very unhealthy format very fast. But Modern did not do that. Modern had this deck that was, what was the number that you would assign to Splinter Twin at its height in terms of its presence in the meta? 10% of the meta?
No, I mean, it would sort of weight more heavily at those pro level events. You would see at the biggest events, at the Pro Tours, the Grand Prix, you would see a lot of Splinter Twin show up because the best players would know how to pilot a deck that was so potent. The thing about the deck that was so important that people need to remember is that you're right, the combo win in that deck was turn 4. That's what you would do. But it was a blue-red control tempo deck that would side out the combo in game 2. The pros that I used to know that would play it all the time would refer to it as, you've got this deck and then these 8 Pokemon cards. And sometimes you just burn the Pokemon cards up because they don't actually play into your regular game plan. You're not usually going to beat down with a 1/4. Occasionally maybe a 2/1, but that's the less resilient copy anyway. So usually it was just a good, consistent, interactive deck that the best players knew how to consistently win with. And it had the end game of, I might just play the Serum Visions into my Splinter Twin and then win on turn 11 if we've gone resource for resource. That's why it was so important.
And it was in no way, when we say it was a turn 4 win, it was in no way a no pilot required turn 4 win. Pilot was absolutely integral to Splinter Twin. This was a gameplay deck where you needed to know what you were doing. Like you said, you might even literally take the combo out, or I mean, there were some people who would begin without the combo and bring the combo in. Maybe you would keep the combo in and not take it out as a way to psych out your opponent, because I do remember those conversations. Oh, turn 1 or game 1, you're up against a Splinter Twin player and they get the Splinter Twin combo. So I've got all my anti-combo pieces in the sideboard, and then they go and take the combo out and I've just got dead cards in hand. But then sometimes, knowing that you know that I know, I'm going to not take out my anti-combo pieces, and then they're going to just leave the combo in. And it was very like, you really have to be skilled at playing that game in order to pull off that combo and in order to fight it. I considered, and I could beat, it was beatable. That's ultimately the thing is that when you look at these other bands in Modern, they're because the deck is dominating, because the deck is unbeatable, because the deck is just so efficient and so good at what it does that it is going to, looking at what Hogak was doing, looking at what Eldrazi was doing, and we'll get to those periods in a moment, but this is in no way comparable to what Splinter Twin was doing. Do you think it's fair for me to say that at its height, when they banned it, Splinter Twin, I mean, it wasn't even winning necessarily every single, it was just top 8ing. There would be 1 to 2 copies in top 8.
Yeah, well, I mean, the very, very first Pro Tour, the one in Philly, it was the reason, I mean, that and Storm, I guess, were the reason that Preordain and Ponder got banned.
Sure.
Because, so just for the listeners or the viewers that don't necessarily know what this deck is, because it's been so long since this was a player in Modern, some people might not even know what it does.
That's true.
You know, and effectively the reason this deck was good is that on turn 1, you would play a cantrip or you'd play a tapped land. Maybe a fetch you'd crack end of turn for it to be tapped. But either way, your turn 1 wasn't that important. Your turn 2 usually was going to be remand. You're going to remand their spell. Turn 3, you have these 2 different flash threats, both of which, if enchanted with a Splinter Twin, can tap to make infinite copies. And because they both flash in and tap down a permanent, they're not only going to flash in, but they're also going to tap down your opponent's piece of interaction. So that if they aren't able to do something in response the turn you play it, they're going to be down 1 of their lands. And on your turn, you hit your 4th land, you cast Splinter Twin, tap it, go infinite, and win the game. And that's how the deck worked. And that was your exact turn 4 curve, I win. Back in those days, when it started, the idea with Modern was this is going to be a turn 4 format, not a turn 3 format, but turn 4. So if the unfair deck was Splinter Twin on turn 4, then the fair deck on turn 4 was Jund. Because if Jund's sequencing is a turn 1 Thoughtseize into a turn 2 Tarmogoyf into a turn 3 Liliana and a turn 4 Bloodbraid Elf, probably if you curve out like that, you're going to win the game.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty good. That's a pretty strong curve. And if you hit your cards in sequence, you're probably going to have generated enough advantage 2-for-1s between your Liliana and your Bloodbraid Elf to just take over. And it was always sort of those 2 things at odds. Even when it became Abzan instead of Jund, it was still those 2 ideals were like the main things you would do. And looking back on it, that feels a heck of a lot more fair than a lot of the stuff that we deal with now.
Right.
You know,
which is my point. So the meme is Splinter Twin did nothing wrong. So tell me what Splinter Twin did wrong. What did it do to warrant the ban? Why should it have been banned? Do you agree with it personally? Looking back all these years, your whole presence as a creator is Modern only, or Modern and Pioneer only largely. So like, you're the Modern master. Do you really think it should have been banned?
Well, at the time when it happened, it was very surprising. And it wasn't surprising because nobody had called it. We actually had Tom Lapilli on an episode. There's a video exists somewhere. It's not on our main channel now. It's, I think, on an older channel. But he had worked at Wizards, and he came and sat down with us and said, bar none, this is the way the conversation goes. There's a closed doors conversation in which we have to make the decision to ban cards to create diversity for a Pro Tour to keep it exciting, or let people keep their cards.
Right.
You know, and it's going to be one or the other. And we're always fighting those 2 ideals. And I think there's a decent chance that Splinter Twin will probably get banned for the reason of a diversity ban.
The decision to do that is what killed Modern. And I know that's painting in broad strokes. That's painting in very broad strokes. But I believe that decision is against everything Modern as a format needed to be, wanted to be, is required for the healthier ecosystem of Magic the Gathering, and that everything else is a result of that error. It's like, go back in the timeline and see where the error went wrong, and that's it, because Modern needed to be the place where you keep your cards. Diversity didn't matter. What it's about is, it's the analogy that's been made is that when you watch a basketball game, you're still seeing the same equipment. You're still seeing a ball getting bounced into a hoop, but it's about the person and the player and the skill involved. And that's what, when you're watching broadcast competitive Magic and you're seeing some of the best players in the world playing in Modern, and it's the same decks every time, but it's how they play them that is so amazing and so engaging. And we as casual players, me, the filthy casual, is I need to be able to keep my cards and to keep my deck. And when you decide we're going to try and make it so that tonight the NBA is playing with triangular shaped balls instead of a regular basketball, or we're going to have 2 hoops instead of 1 because that makes it more interesting and the rules are changing, that is when you have begun the road of disasters coming in that we don't know what 2 hoops is going to do, and there's going to be all kinds of problems, and that people are going to lose interest. And now at home, my driveway is 1 hoop. I don't know that I want to spend the money to put a 2nd hoop in, et cetera, et cetera.
I think, yeah, if you make the sports analogy, it's an interesting one, right? Because you watch your favorite athletes and you think about games like where it's a single player, like
Yeah.
if you watch tennis, maybe your favorite tennis player probably is going to play the same way every single game, every match they play, because that's the thing they know how to do best. And you're a fan of them because you want to see them do the thing they're best at. So you tune in to watch them do the thing you have watched them for years and know they're great at.
Right.
I think I've told you before about this, the largest movie trivia league in the world, this thing I'm a part of, and it's very competitive, right?
Okay.
It's a sport. It's called the Movie Trivia Schmodown. And so you're playing one-on-one against somebody. You're trying to figure out an angle. What do I know that they don't know? What can I figure out? What can I learn that they won't see coming? And if it wasn't that, if it was just who knows the most about movies and there was no game to it, it wouldn't be interesting.
Right.
So you're having to reinvent, but that's your choice, right?
Yeah.
My choice is to learn everything about a different category of movies, the same way that if you are a tennis player and you want to learn a different serve, it's your choice. But if you're great at one thing and it works for you, fans probably, if you're successful at it, want to watch you do the thing you're great at, which is where I don't think diversity bans ever needed to happen.
Right.
Right? It's up to a player if they're playing Splinter Twin for 2 years and they decide, you know what, the metagame has adapted to this too much. People now know I'm going to do this.
Right.
They know my tendencies. They've watched me play this. So I'm going to need to learn how to play Amulet Titan because they're not going to see it coming and they're going
Right.
to sit down against me and they're not going to know what I'm doing. And even if they know the deck, it's a different style of deck.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the diversity ban thing doesn't ever make any sense. And looking back on the Splinter Twin moment, I saw videos around the time Hogak was out, right?
Right.
I watched people put Splinter Twin up against Hogak, and it was laughable. I even watched people put Hogak up against Eldrazi, which we'll get to in a second, and it was still laughable.
Right.
Right? Like the stuff that happened later on.
Hogak did something wrong.
Yeah, it was so ridiculous and
Right.
so not fun to play against, and that it does make the idea. Like, do you think Splinter Twin right now, if it were unbanned, do you think it would be helpful in Modern?
That isn't where my area of expertise. That's where you want to ask someone like well, I would start by asking you guys. I would ask someone like any of the pros or creators who are like I'd ask my friend Jeff Hoagland first
Yeah.
and foremost. Like on those ideas for that. That's not really where I don't know, but I believe that Hogak is a result of the philosophy of we want the format to change. We want the cards to change, and that's going against what we as players wanted and needed, and what the format of Modern was originally designed to do, is to be a place to play with those old cards. And so Hogak, we're skipping a little bit here, but Hogak came about, and this is why I didn't like Modern Horizons at the time, and pretty much still don't, is that the idea is now we're going to introduce ways that the landscape changes, to keep it interesting, to keep things diverse, and that's not what you want. And in order to make that happen, you have to engage in things like, let's break the rules, let's do power creep, let's do fast mana, let's do things like that. Enter Hogak. It's degenerate, it's taking over, it's just a joke, and it's a disaster. And again, imagine the players who went out and bought a play set of Hogak or bought boxes and boxes of Modern Horizons to get them, and then it had to be banned because it was destroying the format. When if you make that decision of Modern is where the decks aren't necessarily going to change, maybe there will be incremental change over time, but we're not intentionally trying to do that. We are okay with every single Modern Pro Tour that there's going to be, here's this pro player with Splinter Twin, but watch how well they play it. They're the master of Splinter Twin. And it's also where you get weird things, where then Modern was a format where and now today it's a lot of a joke about Merfolk, but back when I started, Merfolk was a deck that you really learn how to play Merfolk. You could actually have success with it because Modern was about skill. And if you knew how your deck worked, then you could handle the bad matchup. I beat not a pro player, but a professional grinder at a big, my store had a big event. It was a buy a box event, or a win a box event.
Yeah.
And I was at I was in the final, and it was my Merfolk deck against their Splinter Twin deck. And I beat him. They were very salty about it. And I got my box of I forget the set.
Did you
sort of
open
thing.
it, or did you hold on to it as a keepsake?
I cracked it
Immediately.
I cracked it immediately. But there you go. And it was because I knew that Merfolk deck inside and out, and I believe they even had been handed. It wasn't their Splinter Twin deck; they were handed it from a friend, sort of thing. And so I was like, I know how to handle. You're trying to do this, I'm going to do this, and negate, and there we go. And I knew how to handle Splinter Twin, and so and I think that you need that format. So now we're going to adopt that philosophy. Splinter Twin did nothing wrong, but we banned it for diversity's sake. Enter Eldrazi Winter. Tell me about what was Eldrazi Winter?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting period in Modern's history because Modern has gone for a few years now, and everybody's kind of aware that Splinter Twin is this deck. It's kind of the pillar deck. And there were a lot of conversations before it got banned about would they ever ban it? Should they ban it? Is it too consistent? Are the pros too good with it?
Mm-hmm.
So when this happens, we enter the printing of all these new Eldrazi cards.
Right.
And the combination of Eye of Ugin that had come out long before that, plus Eldrazi Temple, combined with all these new Eldrazi, made for one of the most degenerate Pro Tours ever. If I remember correctly, 6 of the 8 decks that made the top 8 of that Pro Tour were either blue-red or colorless Eldrazi decks. JC, Andrew Brown, that team, East-West Bowl was the team. They won the event. And it was ridiculous. Watching it, it was a clear turn faster, if not 2 turns faster than anything else that anyone was doing in Modern and had ever done. And the idea, because it happened so quickly after the Splinter Twin ban, was, so this is what we're playing with now.
Right. Eldrazi decks are taking over.
It's the only thing anyone played.
It's the only thing anyone played because it was the best deck there was. Now, this is post-Splinter Twin banning.
And it's right after Splinter Twin.
Right after Splinter Twin. And this is a result again. So what happens here? They said that Splinter Twin, they claimed, they lied. I'm going to be honest. I believe they lied. That Splinter Twin was taking over too much of the meta, that it was showing it needed to be banned for that reason, which it wasn't. And then we have Eldrazi decks have literally taken over the format, where they are far beyond, if you just say Eldrazi decks, far beyond even 20% of the format are Eldrazi decks. I don't know the exact number, but I do know it was above that.
Because Bant Eldrazi was those colorless decks were not the
mono black Eldrazi. There was mono red Eldrazi. It was just like Eldrazi.
Yeah, it's all anybody was doing.
Right.
Yeah.
They did not do an emergency ban.
No.
They did not initially ban. They wanted Modern to be, and they wanted Modern to have this aspect of the new standard set has come out. There's cards in standard that are taking over Modern. This is a great thing because if you play Modern, now you have to go buy booster packs or go for standard. This is their dream come true. And so they then ignored everything they claimed to believe in about the health of Modern to allow Eldrazi decks to continue. It was unfun. It was damaging people who had their decks. Again, Modern is the format where I have, look, so there I am with my Merfolk deck.
Yeah.
And now I've gone from I absolutely can show up and play and compete to there is no chance. And it wasn't just tier 2 Merfolk. It was just about every other variant has been washed out by Eldrazi. Meanwhile, a huge portion of the player base has lost their deck due to the Splinter Twin banning. The idea that you can go from Splinter Twin into Grixis Delver, to me, is just like a laughable excuse because that's not the deck people wanted to play. People stopped showing up. My local game store, I've told this anecdote on the channel before, and I know it's anecdotal, but I think it represents it. Pre-Splinter Twin banning, we were having Modern events, 40 to 60 people showing up, and then there's literally a photo on my Twitter timeline of the height of Eldrazi Winter. I showed up to Modern, and I was the only person to show up, and that's how dramatic it was, and I do believe that was indicative of the rest of the thing. And so here we go to, had Splinter Twin never been banned, it's not even so much about like, oh, well, like, do you think it was a gatekeeper that would have kept Eldrazi in check? But it's the philosophy where had Splinter Twin never have been banned, in that alternate universe, when Eldrazi Winter comes up, then it's called, that's where we really have to stick by our guns and have the emergency banning of Eye of Ugin at the very least. Though actually they didn't want to ban the Oath of the Gatewatch Eldrazi card, which would have been much more detrimental.
Well, it was, remember too, we were opening expeditions at this point, and there was an Eye of Ugin expedition. So all these new players that were opening their boxes, they'd rip their $200 land that everybody was so hyped it was the best land, it was what you needed, and it was the fancy version, and they were thinking, it's been like 3 weeks. We can't ban this card. People are literally going to have that experience of opening an expedition right now, and if we ban it right now, they're going to open something that's effectively worthless.
Modern
Also,
should have no connection to that, though. That's again, I feel this is that same decision making, that same thought process to the fundamental misunderstanding of what that format needs to be.
Also, I was just, when you talk about your Merfolk deck, to put it in perspective, so the fast mana colorless deck that people play today of Eldrazi Tron or Tron, right? Let's just pretend that they're on the play and you're playing your Merfolk deck. And here you are with your spreading seas. You're thinking, I'm going to be able to take out their fancy land on turn 2, right? Because I'll create, Island Walk, my Lord of Atlantis and all that.
Right.
So they turn 1, play Eye of Ugin, and they get like an endless one or something down, right? Past you play an island. They go turn 2, Eldrazi Temple, Thought-Knot Seer. They already have a Thought-Knot Seer by the time you can even cast your spreading seas.
Right.
That's the level of power disparity when that deck was able to do what it was doing. You can't even cast your spreading seas on the draw by the time they've actually resolved a 4-drop.
Right.
A ridiculous 4-drop that if they wanted to, they could just take the spreading seas out of your hand with, by the way.
Right. So, and yet no bans. They delayed, they dragged their feet on the bannings because, again, their attention was on that idea of the immediacy of standard and the standard set and the standard packs. And so, again, this is where I make that connection between Splinter Twin and Eldrazi Winter. And then this ties, I believe, very nicely into, so then they eventually ban Eye of Ugin, eventually. Then we unban Golgari Grave Troll. Why are we unbanning Golgari Grave Troll? To diversity, shake things up. Prior to the unbanning of Golgari Grave Troll, was Dredge a prominent deck in Modern?
So I think one of the things that's important to think about with sort of the next phase, as we're calling it, because that moment of turmoil is a big moment of turmoil. But the interesting thing, and this just occurred to me, is that the Grave Troll unbanning, it actually happened before the Splinter Twin banning.
Right.
It's just that nobody was using it yet. It was sitting there and it was dormant. And it was doing things on Magic Online, but it wasn't crushing people. So you had Splinter Twin happen and you had Eldrazi happen. It was only when those were gone that people could look at each other in the face and go, okay, so this Grave Troll thing's a problem.
Well, we went into, remember, Eldrazi happened in Gatewatch on Zendikar, and then where did we go after Zendikar? We went back to Innistrad with all the graveyard stuff, and then all of a sudden, Grave Troll's been unbanned, and this is when Dredge took over that summer.
Dredge had existed from the beginning. There was worse versions of it. But Grave Troll was the moment where they were like, okay, we're going to do something exciting to counteract. Because now we've banned Splinter Twin and now we've banned this Eldrazi card. And it's both been in only about 3 or 4 months, I think this happened.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to do something exciting. And so Grave Troll comes off.
This is what I'm saying. No, you don't want to do something exciting. You want to keep the waters calm and modern. Go on. You want to do something exciting. No, people have stopped playing. We're done. My $1,000 deck has been banned out. Go on. We'll keep it exciting by, again.
Yeah, and so the next like sort of phase is they're trying to figure out, like, are people interested in Modern? And we were pretty hot on Modern at this point. This is 2017. So I mean, Alex and I were pretty excited about the format after this.
Yeah.
You know, I think there was a little bit of looking around. I think people were questioning, did the Splinter Twin ban ever need to happen? One of the big conversations that was happening in this period is people started asking each other, when's Stoneforge Mystic going to get unbanned? Because I think we all sort of assumed, and it's funny that Jace actually got unbanned before Stoneforge. We all assumed Jace was like the one that'll never get unbanned, but Stoneforge could happen. And so, you know, everybody was talking about this. And it's the next phase when you see Grixis Death Shadow start to appear for the first time in 2017. And in early 2018 is when you see Humans. And I think what's important about that is that those are both pretty fair decks. Right? There was an earlier version of Grixis Death Shadow that had popped up, like the Teamer Battle Rage version, where it's trying to just sort of one-shot you. But people didn't realize for a little while that actually Grixis Death Shadow it's kind of just the Delver of Modern. You know, it's like Delver of Secrets. Like, I want to say Teamer Delver won the second Modern GP ever, but Delver never really took over as like a dominant force in Modern because we don't have good enough cantrips. We don't have any way to fix the top of our libraries in the format. But Grixis Shadow kind of was that deck, right? It's kind of just like Teamer Thresh from Legacy, except in Modern. So that's the period of time where Humans breaks out. It's a fair deck. You know, you're seeing Spirits starts to be a deck. You're seeing, you know, tribal decks are popping up here and there, but there isn't like a dominant force that's just the only deck in Modern. That phase hasn't happened, right? Like, there's only a couple moments you can think of in the whole format where there truly is a dominant deck, and it's an unfairly good dominant deck. We didn't even really cover, you know, in the period before Splinter Twin, the pod banning. I mean, that was a huge one too, is the delve spells all got banned the same time pod got banned.
But wouldn't you say that the pod banning was a result of it actually taking over and it actually becoming this hard to interact with, hard to beat, best deck sort of situation where, yes, you do need to step in and ban it because it is far more than 10% of the meta?
It's similar principles, I think, to the twin deck in that if you have a deck that's really good without the combo anyway, and then you have a combo built into it that can just win the turn it wants to, that's when the biggest problem decks usually happen, unless they're just doing something that's like a turn 1, turn 2 combo that I just win out of nowhere. Like that's what we saw. You know, I mean, Eldrazi wasn't quite that, but it wasn't a combo deck, but like it was doing that on turn 2. But Pod was like that. I mean, Pod won 3 GPs in a row.
Right.
So and that's hard to do.
How many GPs did Splinter Twin win?
At least 1, I think.
1.
Yeah.
You think?
Well, I'm pretty. It definitely didn't.
I see a big difference between those two things.
It never won 3 in a row. I can tell you that much. Yeah.
I see a big difference between those things.
Yeah.
I see a big difference.
Yeah, and I want to say Pod got second at a PT, and there was that period of time. But again, it's very rare that in Modern's history you'll have one dominant thing that's the only unfair thing anyone's doing. It's usually a couple things at once, and then they're trying to figure out what the correct move is, which is why at the time they banned Birthing Pod, they also banned Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise in the same banning cycle.
Right.
You know, and so I think all that stuff has sort of happened in the past, and now we're in the post-Eldrazi, post-Dredge, and that to me feels like there's 2 years there that feel like it's some of the fairest gameplay in Modern.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's where you start to see like new strategies popping up, and I think that there's one card in particular in this period of time that stands out to me. Prison deck started to become really good, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember Zach Elsick made Lantern Control a thing.
Right.
And I remember Jerry Thompson did very well with Mardu Pyromancer. But those 2 decks were relying pretty heavily on Ancient Stirrings and Faithless Looting.
Right.
And those 2 cards, you know, they'd been legal for a while, but it was around that time that I think people started to realize these are the 2 cards that are enabling a lot of the most unfair things, right? Hollow One is a deck that doesn't really work without Faithless Looting. As we got later into, you know, Phoenixes later on, same thing. Faithless Looting is the most important card in the deck. You know, I remember we had Jerry Thompson on the podcast. I think he got second at a PT playing Pyromancer. And I seem to remember him saying to us, you know, this card's really good, Faithless Looting, it's great in my deck, but it's actually just a good card, period. I don't even think it's the card disadvantage people are talking about. I think people should just be playing more Faithless Lootings in their deck.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that good.
Right.
You know, and I think that's the period of time where those 2 cards really rose to prominence. Obviously, you know, Grixis Death Shadow wasn't taking advantage of Ancient Stirrings or anything like that, and it really wanted its graveyard to be full. If I recall, I don't even think that it was playing Faithless Looting. I think it was playing Thought Scour instead. But I definitely do remember this time period thinking, because we had a lot of conversations about Mox Opal, Ancient Stirrings, and Faithless Looting, that we were, which one of those is going to go first? And it's kind of amazing to me that Stirrings is still legal. It's the only one of those 3 that still is legal in the format. Because for a while, we both thought that was the first one that was going to go.
I just think that there's a huge difference between a card being banned because it is taking over the format. Like, you know, Hollow One was starting to take over, and Dredge was taking over, and Faithless Looting just is a perfect little bullseye there. But look at, for example, the banning of Mox Opal, something people have been talking about for a long time, but it was really, in a lot of ways, is it fair for me to say that Modern Horizons, which again, this is this set that is engineered to essentially kind of encourage the idea of a soft rotation, you know, in Modern, and it was with Modern Horizons and Urza coming into Modern that we went and banned Mox Opal, which completely killed Affinity, which has been a deck, you know, going on since Modern's early days.
It's the most dominant tournament deck, yeah.
Right. And again, there's that idea of I had my Affinity deck, I had my cards. Mox Opal was in how many master sets? 1 or 2?
It was definitely in 2. I think it might have been in
it was in 2. It was an expedition. It was a masterpiece for Kaladesh.
Yeah.
And then again, it's this idea of, for, you know, an Affinity, it's present, but it's not taking over. Affinity itself is not, until we end up with Modern Horizons bringing us cards like Urza, and we need to get rid of Mox Opal because of what, you know, Urza is doing with Opal. And the effect that has. I mean, think of the players that got washed out of Modern as a result of the banning of Mox Opal. Think about how much money got lost by people. And it comes into, again, that philosophy that I have that is not good for that format, that what we needed was not to have Modern Horizons, was not to have made for Modern cards with the intent of pushing out and enabling other things, or that Urza maybe should have been the ban because, but we're not going to do that because Modern Horizons is the new set. They didn't want to ban Hogak. They dragged their feet on Hogak like crazy.
I mean, they banned Bridge from Below first because they didn't want to ban Hogak. I think
when you come at the king, you best not miss.
I think your point about Horizons is really interesting because I recall having conversations with people and there were sort of murmurs. It was like, okay, what do you think about the idea of there being cards printed directly into Modern? You know, that are never going to, and Alex and I talked about it on the show, and most of the idea was like, well, I think it's possible you could do it, but what's wrong with what we've been doing? And what was wrong with it is that, they didn't want to print things into standard of a high power level. So you had to get lucky, and the only way the format would really change drastically is with a really pushed mechanic like a delve, or you would have to get redundancy. So like, redundancy is where you'll see the format change. That's when like Supreme Phantom changed the format, right? Supreme Phantom is a card that was not unfair in standard because there wasn't like crazy unfair levels of spirit support. It was good, but as you combined it with Drog Skull Captain and the other cards that already existed in the Modern format, Supreme Phantom all of a sudden made it so that, Bant Spirits could win back-to-back GPs, right? It became a real deck. And classically, it's the healthiest way to put new cards into Modern is you just have to wait for that redundancy to get created kind of almost by chance, because we know they don't test for Modern. Horizons is an interesting moment because they obviously had to design these cards to be exciting and flashy, and they wanted to shake up the format, and it really did. It's just the power creep, it shifts the paradigm so drastically when you have that much power put in all at once.
When you have a format where decks are $700, shake up is not what you want. And this is why, and every single video I do on this channel that's a Modern deck tech, the overwhelming mass of players is saying this is too expensive. This is not something I'm going to get into. And you're creating, like, how do you feel about the fact that with Pioneer coming out, people are now saying Modern is the new Legacy? Think of the way the perception of Legacy is it's an inaccessible format. And so you go, and I will trace then these events all the way back to Splinter Twin, and you took an accessible format, and you've now made it. Do you feel, can you look me in the eye and say that Modern as it is today is accessible?
Yes.
Yes.
It is.
It is accessible.
Yes, it's accessible because a lot of the best decks right now are still fair decks. It's not prohibitively expensive. And a lot of those best decks that are accessible, they're not unfair in the way that you would have to worry about your cards getting banned.
Okay.
While in the past, at the same banning cycle we talked about a second ago with Grave Troll, Gataxian Probe also was banned.
Right.
But Death Shadow would love to have Gataxian Probe. It used to play it. Can still function without Gataxian Probe. That deck is great. That deck's one of the best decks in the format.
Name me one of the mainstays of Modern currently.
Grixis Shadow is always one.
Grixis Shadow. How much does that cost?
I'd have to look it up offhand, but probably between $600 and $900, I would think.
$600 and $900. So I go out today and I spend or trade. I use assets, be it money or cards, to put this $600 to $900 deck together. And then next year, what's coming out literally in fewer than 12 months is probably Modern Horizons 2, which is, again, amped up, shake up the format cards that have a very good chance of, you said, no, maybe nothing's going to get banned out of Grixis Shadow, but again, pushing Grixis Shadow into a point where it is no longer what it was. And when we go through the list, don't you feel that is something that is really hindering access? This idea that I do $600 to $900 on a deck, and 8 months later, it essentially rotated out.
I think
Or call me on it if I'm being, too extreme on this and I'm being too panic heavy, then why does Pioneer even need to exist? Why do we even need Pioneer?
I think your point is there's two pieces to your point, right? So I could have looked you in the face and told you at any point in time, there's a high likelihood Mox Opal will eventually get banned. I've been saying it for 4 years. Just because it's fast mana, it's breaking rules, it's doing the thing that unfair things do, right?
Right.
So at any point in time, if you were playing a deck that relied on Mox Opal, I would have told you.
Prior to Urza and Modern Horizons, how many decks relied on Mox Opal?
Several.
Several?
Yeah.
Really?
I mean, there's the Artifact Prison decks. You had Whir Prison. Prior to that, you had Lantern. You had Hardened Scales. You had Affinity. So Urza became sort of the prison deck du jour.
Right.
But like, if you were a deck that played Mox Opal, you had to realize that was a thing that could happen to you. Your $100 Mox Opals were,
Right.
I have one and it's not worth any money.
Right.
Or it's not worth what it was.
No.
But if you're talking about a deck like Grixis Shadow, I think my advice to somebody, if you really want to make sure you're protecting yourself, then play a deck that's inherently fair. Make sure you're not playing an unfair deck. You're playing something that is interacting, because no matter how powerful Modern gets, thought seizing you 2 times in the first 2 or 3 turns and backing it up with a giant threat will still always be something you can try to win with.
Mm-hmm.
You'll still always have a shot to win with that, because that's what Magic is. Mostly it's attacking and interacting. And that's what the deck does, right? So I would say the same thing for humans. You probably can pretty comfortably buy humans. I mean, I can't think of a card in humans right now. It got pretty bad for a minute there with that deck, and they didn't ban anything. They could have banned like Ancient Ziggurat, I guess, or one of the lands. Maybe.
How much does humans cost?
I mean, I don't have them pulled up in front of me, but I think most of these decks, unless you're talking like Jund, is a really expensive deck. Jund is like high levels of money, but I'll bet you humans is $600 or less.
Okay.
I don't think it's too expensive, because the most expensive cards in humans are probably like your Aether Vials and your Cavern Souls.
Right.
Cavern Souls is like $60-$70. I don't know. I could be misquoting the prices here.
Sure.
I haven't looked at modern prices in a second. But I definitely do think that if you're trying to make sure you're protected, playing a fairer deck is one of the best ways to do it. Those aren't really the cards. Like, they did that in the past. Like banning Bloodbraid Elf, that was a mistake. Everybody knows that banning Bloodbraid Elf, it was a false banning. It was Deathrite Shaman that eventually got banned, and everybody knows that's really what needed to get banned. And it got banned in Legacy. I think your point about Modern comparing it to Legacy, though, is a really interesting one to talk about. Because when it started in 2012, Legacy hadn't been popular for that long, right? We had been talking about Extended and New Extended, and people had been trying to figure out what the new format was going to be. But now Modern is bigger than Legacy, right? There are more unique cards in Modern than there are in Legacy. So the differences between Modern and Legacy, they're this big. It's basically Force of Will, but we have Force of Negation.
Yeah.
Daze is only played in pretty much one deck. It's basically Wasteland and Force of Will are the 2 cards in Legacy that are like distinctly format defining. Maybe Brainstorm, because setting the top of your library for a Delver is pretty important, and for miracles and things like that. But honestly, playing a high-level Modern deck against a high-level Legacy deck probably doesn't feel that different anymore.
Do you agree with my premise that Modern, that there needs to be a format that exists where I can play with my old cards, where my old cards have a home? And yes, if there are decks and cards that are running rampant, we do need to ban them. But that the thesis of this format is that for the most part, we want to ensure that old cards have a home and a place where they can be played and enjoyed, so that other formats such as Standard and other new sets, have a reason for me to pursue and buy cards and say, well, maybe this will go into Modern, maybe this will find a home in Modern. Or do you agree with that premise or disagree?
I absolutely agree.
Then do you not feel that perhaps Modern Horizons works against that premise? Because then that is superseding my existing cards. That is saying you already have existing cards. You already have your cards, but we're now going to print cards with pushed power levels that would never go through Standard, and that are therefore going to be what you need to pick up to play in that same format. Isn't that at odds with that philosophy drastically?
That's a hard one to answer, because I think of Time Spiral, then I think of Modern Masters 1, and then I think about Horizons. They to me, those feels like a trio of sets. And there's only one of those that the power level is really off the charts pushed, right? And it's Horizons. But the mechanics and the whole idea that you're combining weird things all together to create this unique experience, they all feel pretty similar in that regard. I do think that the power level being pushed is a little problematic, but I also think we're being unfair to Horizons, because 2019 was just an absurd year. Like, Planeswalkers were pushed really hard in the year. So
yes.
War of the Spark was almost as problematic as Modern Horizons, and it is a Standard set. I think, just the card Oko, period, is on the power level of anything in Modern Horizons, and it's problematic. It's not just one set. That was in Standard.
Right.
So the design of cards, I think they've taken responsibility over at WotC pretty hard. They've been pretty clear about it, that we designed this way, but the amount of time that has to pass, is such that we couldn't have predicted this and we're going to do a better job. And I believe them. I don't think they want to kill the game. So
No, of course not.
I would even,
but I believe that they want Modern to rotate. Do you believe they want Modern to rotate?
no.
You don't believe they want Modern to essentially, like that they said, well, we're not going to have it traditionally rotate, but we would like there to be mechanisms in place for it to pseudo-rotate.
So you're thinking like the idea of every year a new Modern Horizons or 2 years of Modern Horizons
Right.
is going to shake up the format so much that everybody has to go buy a bunch of new products.
Or other behind-the-scenes things, such as when cards are certain cards are pushed in standard and then not banned for taking over, where that they essentially are trying to find the way to enable that. That's like, again, you talk about the behind closed doors.
Yeah.
So it's behind closed doors, and they say, we just really wish this format rotated. Well, what if we find a way to force it to rotate, essentially? Like maybe not a full rotation, but a soft rotation. I mean, isn't that Modern Horizons, a soft rotation?
If you look at the decks, so again,
If I look at the meta before and after Modern Horizons, how dramatically did it change?
I think you have to look at it before 2019.
Yeah. It was a hell of a year, 2019, but not in a good way.
Because if you look at the effect that the major cards in War of the Spark had on the format, they're just as damaging. Or
Sure.
I mean, 3 mana Teferi, Karn, and Narset made as much of an impact on Modern.
That's fair.
That's
very fair.
Everything in Horizons.
Yeah.
Right.
That's very fair. And in all honesty, imagine redoing Horizons and just let's magically not have Hogak in it. And suddenly, you know, I do, and I've admitted this on the channel before in conversations. Like, if you made it so that Hogak never existed, then I really sound like a lunatic for being worried about Horizons, because all it kind of did was add to the format, with the exception of, I guess, Opal needing to be banned because of Urza. But like, you know, they just maybe missed the mark on Hogak, was a bit too much. Okay, and then I want to ask you about Pioneer. Do you view Pioneer as a response to Modern, basically? I don't want to be as dramatic as to say failing, but if I want to go back to my original premise of this video, that the banning of Splinter Twin and the philosophy behind the banning of Splinter Twin was ultimately a decline in Modern over the years, and each of these incidents largely was based on that philosophy, is Pioneer not a band-aid to the result of where we ended up with Modern? Why do we have Pioneer? Why do we need Pioneer? Why does it exist at all? It feels like this kind of like, Modern is just nuked, let's start over with Pioneer.
I think if you're like sailing a ship and you're collecting treasure at a bunch of different ports and your ship is slowly falling apart and the ship gets heavier because you keep picking treasure up and more holes keep popping open, it's not going to get any easier to patch the holes while you're sailing and picking new stuff up.
Right.
And that's kind of, when I think about Modern as a format, that's just where we are. The format's enormous at this point. We have so much history. There are so many decks. You can't print products or create band-aids enough to keep up with the demands of that format. So you're not a sinking ship. You're just getting heavier and you're getting creakier. And there are more holes and you really can't patch them all. So to me, Pioneer is not so much a band-aid as it's let's build a new ship. And it's also, think about the effect that Arena's having on Magic right now. And think about when you see people signing up to play Arena, even if they wanted to create Modern in Arena is close to insurmountable for a little while. It's a lot. It's a huge amount of information you would have to code into that game. So Pioneer to me represents...
Oh, I hope we get Pioneer on Arena, but you know why I hope we get Pioneer on Arena?
Why?
Because once Pioneer is 100, the day comes that Pioneer is 100% on Arena, then the conversation is, well, if we did that, now it's just as far from now to put all of Modern on Arena.
And I agree. And I don't think it's impossible. I just think that the idea, if you have this new group of people that are playing Arena, people are finding it for the first time. Hearthstone players are now playing Magic. And if they're doing that, you need to have some way to show them, hey, there is this accessible thing. It's only a few years old. It's not quite as expensive. You probably understand a third of the cards because you're playing with them on Arena in Standard right now. Go buy some packs, learn Paper Magic. If you don't want to just play the same thing you're playing digitally, we have this cool play experience that you can do in paper. And it's not that expensive and it's not that different. That's to me what Pioneer is. And I actually have some faith in Pioneer. I like the format. I think it's pretty cool. I like that it feels a little different than Modern. But I do wonder, in 2 years, how different will it really feel?
And that's the thing when I look at it and I say, to bring this full circle, I look at Pioneer and I see Pioneer becoming just as degenerate as Modern already. And it's only going to get more and more sets added to it. I see Pioneer getting very close in expense to Modern. And so there are more lower end cost decks in Pioneer, but not by much. And there's many Pioneer decks that are essentially Modern deck prices. And I think that that's only going to meet itself in the middle more and more when you get to a point where Pioneer is just as expensive as Modern, or almost as expensive as Modern, and just as degenerate or almost as degenerate as Modern. Then is it really a brand new ship or just a smaller ship? Because it's then a ship where you can play with fewer of your cards. And again, it all the way goes back to that original premise of, and Pioneer doesn't meet it, because my old cards, my old elves cards and my merfolk cards and all of these cards, they're not in Pioneer. And so where do I play with those cards? What is available to me to use those cards in? Are we just turning into Commander only? There's definitely some arguments to be said that we might be. But if the philosophy is there needs to exist an ecosystem where the most non-reserve list cards that we can get together can basically be tended to exist and to stay and not be thought of, this isn't about selling standard packs, this is about the longevity of the game, then Pioneer doesn't meet those criteria. Pioneer is not a suitable alternative to Modern. And what it comes down to is we have to do what we've never wanted to do, which is to just say, all right, it's not about diversity. It's about getting to keep your cards. That's my
fair.
premise. That's fair. All right, I win. No, it's not a debate.
I think it's fair. I think we've seen, look, there's only a couple real truths to Magic's history, right? There's only a couple like really hard and fast things that have been created that we don't get to argue with. One of them is the reserve list.
Right.
If the reserve list didn't exist, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. Modern would become Legacy. That's exactly what would happen.
If the reserve list didn't exist, they would make vintage masters in paper and would not print any of the original dual lands in it.
It would be now
because they never printed any of the original fetch. They only once printed the fetch lands in Modern. They had 7 Modern Masters and only once reprinted 5 of the 10 fetch lands in it. So we take away the reserve list, it's gone. Vintage Masters, there will be no original duels in it.
So I really truly think though that the reserve list is the one thing. It's almost like this like unorganic sort of like, right? It has to exist because of what it is. And if they took it away, it would be a huge issue. It would be a huge issue. And then I don't think they ever could. But that's the only thing that keeps Legacy from being Modern. And if you didn't have the reserve list, then we would have one non-rotating format. It would be the one. It would be the Highlander. There could only be one of the world. And something like Pioneer would be so drastically different because you have this one thing that's forever.
Right.
And then you have this thing that's a few years.
Right.
So play this thing that's a few years and you don't have to worry about these old cards. But because of Legacy sort of being what it is and being this weird, and Vintage, I guess, to some degree, being these weird like little benchmarks at the beginning of the whole thing, it makes it feel like we have to draw these lines and separate things out when in reality, we all just want the same thing, which is to be able to play with the cards we own.
Just be able to play with the cards we own, which is what I need to be. I'm going to give you the final word then on this. And it's going to be a question then about the future of Modern.
Yeah.
What do you see as the future of Modern? Where are we headed? Where are we going?
Modern's the best format in Magic. It's the most fun format in Magic. It's the deepest format. It's the one that it invites you to brew and get the deepest into. We have a Netflix series coming out about Magic. We have Arena taking off. We have, obviously it's been a weird year, but we have a record high all-time interest in Magic between Arena and Paper. And Modern's the best format. So as long as Wizards keeps it together and doesn't do something to tank it, and they listen to the people that matter, and they listen to the players that love it and support the format, it will go down as the format in Magic. And it should. And it will eventually end up on Arena if they do it right. But it'll take a while.
Ben Bateman, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Oh, what do you think of Pauper, by the way?
It doesn't rotate enough.
Oh, shut!
Now, if you want to have a good understanding of the modern format, a great place to start is Junt. The way Jund generally wins is by reducing their opponent's resources while applying threats that are quick and aggressive and making sure that opponent doesn't have an ability to stop them from winning the game. Generally, this is done on turn 1 by casting something like a Thoughtseize or Inquisition of Kozilek. Turn 2, casting a threat such as Goyf. On turn 3, casting the Planeswalker Liliana of the Veil. On turn 4, casting a Bloodbraid Elf or another aggressive threat that then allows you to gain card advantage by cascading into something such as the new Elder Titan Kroxa, Lightning Bolt, or Gulligan's Command, making them discard, killing one of their threats, or rebuying maybe a creature that they were able to get rid of or remove.